I'm delighted to have in the Design Notes studio the designer of Votes for Women, Tory Brown. Tory, welcome to the Design Notes studio.
Thank you, Ben. I'm very glad to be here.
So, we live in a society where false modesty is valued. But this first question is going to allow you to be unfalsely braggadocious as you want. So the first question is, regarding your game design, when did you know that you were good at what you do?
I'm good at what I do. I don't know. I'm still waiting on it. Reading very generous and kind reviews of Votes for Women is helping in this process of understanding what I've done as a first-time designer. But it's still hard to believe that something I spent so much time on has been so warmly received.
And is it just external reinforcement, or was there a point during the design process where you thought, oh, this is really good actually?
Uh, it's mostly external. I think that the playtest process was good in both getting feedback and seeing that lots of people were really enjoying it. But there was also a moment of deciding what sort of advice or recommendations or comments not to give much weight to. And that gave me a sense that like my vision, I, the idea I have for my game was something that was really solidly structured. And when someone said, well, I think you ought to do this, I could say, well, no, because that's not what I'm doing. So internally, the playtest process really helped shape my concept of what I wanted my game to be. And then some of the external feedback helped improve and build upon what I had sort of laid out, but helped me sort of start sharply focused on what I wanted to do in the process.
So let's go back to the beginning then. What was the journey that got you into designing Votes for Women?
I would say it starts 20 years ago when I started my career in movement building. I come to be a designer on the strength of the theme and the content of the game. And that's where I've spent most time, blood, sweat, and tears. The idea to apply it to a game came in the last 3 years when my friend Kevin Bertram started Fort Circle Games. And he had just released Shores of Tripoli, a game about the Barbary pirates, and was asking all of our friends, what do you think a great game would be? And I mentioned to him that I thought the suffrage movement, the 70 years of history, the push and pull of attention of a movement, and the ultimate ratification of the 19th Amendment would just make a lot of sense and it'll be a lot of fun as a board game. And I thought that he would then take that idea and do it. And instead he said, okay, you do it. And so it came from playing games like Watergate in 1960, Making of a President, and sort of just deep, intensive research process that created a lot of ideas about mechanics and the narrative of the game that plays out.
And so what is your history as a gamer? Because if someone said to me, oh, I'm looking for a subject for a game, and I gave them a subject and they just said, oh, go on then, go and make it, I would freeze. I mean, I simply wouldn't know what to do. I mean, what's your history as a gamer, and what's your experience with games, and what kind of research did you do for Votes for Women?
Sure. I sort of happily call myself a normie game designer, game player. Trivial Pursuit and Life and some of the really light titles growing up in my family. I think things started to get a little bit deeper when I bought Watergate. I was just so amazed that someone could turn that kind of history into something enjoyable and something that taught me new information, and I had a great time playing. And sort of that deeper, sort of more gritty kind of game, I think really taught me a lot about what games could be. And then when I started this process and started researching Votes for Women, Kevin gave me 1960 Making of a President. And it really just sort of clicked from there, right? When I was researching, I started with two started with a spreadsheet and two tabs, and I had them labeled support and oppose. And each cell was a different person or an event or a book that was published or some sort of content. And before I even realized what I was doing, I was building out decks. And so, the fact that Votes for Women became a card-driven game, born out of inspiration from games like Watergate 1960, but also that's just sort of how my research developed. And I couldn't think of another way to get that many amazing personalities, that much artwork, that much nuance and history into a game than having these individual cards for each side.
I remember a couple of Christmases ago, a friend of mine bought me a game, and it was the Gandhi coined game. And one of our friends who wasn't a gamer was there and just looked at me and said, "There's a Gandhi board game." I mean, when you played something like Watergate, was it just a moment of, wow, these games do this? Was it a surprise to you?
Yeah, I had never thought about games like that. I mean, I think I had seen, I don't know, party games, right, where you play decks and you make people think dirty thoughts, or some little gritty games that have like an IP Jurassic Park game where you're research management and worker placement. Pretty light themes, right, are very sort of fantasy driven. The idea that political stories, that stories about our own history that don't include, warring fronts and cannonballs and all that kind of stuff can be played out, was it's shocking, right? And how well it works. And it made me think a lot about how politics tends to sort of stay in one lane and games tend to stay in another. But in this idea, in this process of movement building, suffragists understood we need lots of different ways to communicate with people. They were standing on street corners, they were publishing their own newspapers, and they were making games. They wanted the movement and the work to be fun and to identify and to connect with people wherever they were. And that's something that I've brought forward in my career, that connecting with people where they are. And if that's at the game table, that's great. If that's at a town hall, that's great. They're equal and valid and great options, because we need to be connecting with people if we want to make the world a better place. And it turns out that board games have this power too, and that play and pretend and games can be a powerful tool for the kind of change that I want to see in the world.
So, for those who don't know, you've had a history in politics and political movements for quite a long time. What in your previous life, being a game designer, gave you the qualifications to make this game?
Well, I think that I spent some time as a researcher. I even had a Library of Congress library card, which is pretty amazing. And it's the National Archives. It's essentially, we actually have a National Archives, but the Library of Congress is a main resource for knowledge in America. So I've spent a long time putting together research briefs and doing deep dives and trying to figure out just exactly what it is that an audience needs to know about complicated subject matters. I think that my work across various movements, and I've done work on the reproductive rights, on labor movement, on enviro work, just sort of a big government accountability. It's about seeing how all of these pieces fit together. And when you're making a board game, there are a lot of pieces to fit together and a lot of balance that's necessary, especially in these decks, as you are, adding power and influence across the country and taking it away, ensuring that overall you're not spending too much time in one area or on one subject. That those are all pieces of the work that I've done as a political organizer as well. It's a lot more literal in game design, but it still is about these sort of like balancing of resources and having limited information about sort of an infinite number of scenarios. And so I think that the political work has created a sort of like, you have to have a very laser sharp vision of success and of sort of victory conditions, and building out the pieces necessary to have your audience or you achieve those outcomes. And these are all pieces of strategy and of resource management that are necessary in game design.
So I'm sure there are debates with Votes for Women as to whether it's a war game or not. Because, definitions in the war game space are particularly heated. But, you know, when it comes to a campaign like women's suffrage, are there any sort of, in terms of strategy, in terms of tactics, any similarity to a military campaign?
I think quite a bit. I think while the struggle was nonviolent, it was still in direct confrontation with established power, and you have to, you see the suffragist side during Votes for Women deploying resources to the front lines, and whether that's out west where women's suffrage really caught on quickly, or where in the east or the south where it was just sort of almost sort of a lost cause, if you will, that identifying the strategies and tactics that will achieve different outcomes. There was a moment where the suffragists thought that a Supreme Court route would be the way to achieve their victory, and that was quickly stymied by a court case involving the state of Missouri. And so having to regroup and redeploy, having to spend a lot of time, I think, in the churn of just day-to-day battle, because we know it's not all excitement and explosions. There's a lot of drudgery in warfare, that comes through as well. And I think this idea of reshaping maps, right? The way that the suffrage movement reshaped political maps, both in states as they were created, as well as then electorates that, suddenly doubled in size overnight once women were enfranchised, all have these sort of similarities to war and the process and outcomes of violent conflict. That my game doesn't include bayonets and U-boats is a testament to, I think, the nonviolent struggle and the sort of specific tactics that the suffragists chose. But it was a struggle nonetheless. And I think the game itself uses the kind of language of war game, these sort of balancing power and influence, using card-driven tactics, these different tracks where you're sort of gaining power and losing it in certain fronts, like the Supreme Court. I think it's clear that folks who play Votes for Women feel like they've just played a war game. It seems to be, from my perspective, that the people who don't think Votes for Women deserves to be a war game or called a war game haven't played it. And you can play the game and not like it. That's it's a game, right? Like, people have preferences, but it's hard, it seems, to deny that the language and the outcome of the game differs wildly from a lot of war games.
And so when we think about history, we think about historical events in discrete chunks, and we almost, it's kind of the way we study them, when we kind of think about them being separate events. But of course, things happen simultaneously. I mean, what effect did the American Civil War have on the suffrage movement? Was it a boon to the suffrage movement, or did it basically put it on hold for the length of the Civil War?
It was on ice. It was a huge disruption to America as we knew it then and as we know it now. There weren't options to campaign. Everything was sort of focused on wartime organizing. And it not only, the suffrage movement was still in a very nascent stage in 1860, and the American Civil War starts. There had been these national conventions where the disparate members of the movement would come together to share strategies and ideas, and the sort of just even the basics of moving from place to place and getting someone from Kansas to Philadelphia or vice versa became incredibly difficult and expensive during the Civil War. And so everybody just sort of hunkered down, and everything sort of just took on a hold. And it was really hard coming out of the Civil War for the suffrage movement to reinvigorate itself and to find new options and new pathways. And so it set back the cause for quite some time, as it did the American economy and the American political environment. It was that also coming out of the Civil War were divisions about how to approach the 15th Amendment. And those divisions also created a lot of challenges for the suffrage movement. So the impact of the Civil War cannot be overstated in the suffrage movement as well as in American history. But I think you make an interesting point about how we learn history in silos. and that we can be shocked to learn that while the Civil War was happening, the suffrage movement was, right? Like, because those are often in school, they're in different units, right? You learn this in March and this in October. And it's always just really fascinating to then sort of blend these things together. And I hope that the decks and Votes for Women do that and create a sort of background hum of what else was happening in America while the suffrage movement was working, fighting, and struggling for the vote.
Serious people don't like to talk about counterfactuals, but I'm not a serious person, and I think they're fabulous. So, do you think that women's suffrage would have happened a lot sooner without the Civil War?
No, I think that the suffrage movement needs to take as long as it did because society needed that long to refashion its own concepts of womanhood. And that, maybe it would have happened a little bit faster, but that the suffrage movement is happening while women are changing what they can wear and what's expected of them, what, ideas of relationships and property rights. Like each of these sort of different renegotiated balances of power build upon themselves to then ensure that women have the right to vote. And we know that even then we had not reestablished balances of power on a racial line. And so it took even longer for especially Black women in the South to actually have access to the ballot box, even if the 19th Amendment was on page. So the cultural changes happening alongside, pushed and pulled by the suffrage movement, take this certain amount of time. Even something as simple as the bicycle, right? Its development and spread in the late 1800s is important for women to have a different kind of dress and to have autonomy and go places by themselves without requiring a male escort. And you just can't, without the Civil War, it still takes some time for that change of dress and autonomy to play out in the way that it did. So I wish that, the United States could have just done away with slavery and ended, sort of the gross ownership of human beings, and that would have fueled all kinds of things. But I think, coming out of the Civil War, the 15th Amendment, Reconstruction, the ideas and challenges about what citizenship means, we needed to go through that in order for women in the 1920s to achieve their outcomes.
So can you give us an overview of designing the game, sort of from, having that conversation with Kevin through to the game being sent off to the publisher and both the game design and the research?
Sure. So research led everything. Like I mentioned, I started this Google Doc, and my spreadsheet had a support tab and an oppose tab, and I created a bunch of Dropbox folders, so many Dropbox folders. And honestly, I started on Wikipedia, and that the Wikipedia page on the suffrage movement as a sort of like, what are the tent pole moments? What is the key, what is the very basic of information that gets included and people should know as they're, reading a page and a half of information. And from there, it sort of spreads like wildfire, if you excuse the inappropriate current phrase. There is a wealth of information, fortunately, online, because I was doing this research during the pandemic. And so using the Library of Congress, which has an amazing collection, suffragists were tight with the librarian, the national librarian at the time. And so the Library of Congress is a repository for a number of personal collections of suffragists at the time, and magazines, letters, all sorts of photos and images from the time. Also, the National Archives has a great repository. State historical societies received funding from Congress around the centennial of the suffrage amendment. So that really helped me focus in on some of those regional people that are featured in the cards that help us sort of build out power in different locations. And then a bunch of books and ebooks from the library, and all sort of like expanding on that basic structure of, sort of what Wikipedia gave me as a foundation. And it was important to me to identify new voices and people who had done a lot of work but weren't sort of vaunted in the history books. And so identifying those and ensuring that there's a range of voices, and whether that's Mabel Ping-Hua Lee in New York, and her work as a Chinese American and the difficulty of, establishing the enfranchisement while not being a citizen. Certainly African American organizers like Watkins and by Bethune, making sure that different voices are included, right? So all this sort of targeted research. And so moving from the design phase, right? Like once I figured out that it was a map, sort of like the idea, like 1960, putting these cubes on, the sort of piece becomes about writing that card text and how do I, what does each card do? And I was able to group different sort of similar themes. So, lots of suffragists are given, the opportunity to put 8 cubes in any region, no more than 2 per state, or events that have these sort of specific ideas. And so that helps, I think, sort of narrow down or focus the card play when you can have these sort of thematic groupings. As I decided, and I think some of the playtesting came through, that like a congressional track was necessary, I needed to go back and do a bunch of research on senators. And as you're playing the game, as your opposition, you're pulling up these sort of really crusty white dudes that are opposed to suffrage. And it was easy to find these gentlemen that remove power from the congressional track, but to find a quote from them and a picture that would work, in lots of ways, research drove design, but in some ways, design drove research, just as these things are happening. Then I think the second to last piece was the state cards. When in playtesting, we realized that folks were having trouble moving across the board. The state cards incentivize players to move to specific states, and that deck is 9 cards out of a 12 card deck, so it changes a bit every time. And then the strategy deck, that is you bid on the strategy cards based on buttons, helped, I think, also fuel play and keep the button economy moving. And again, sort of like I think the last piece of the design process that really helped give it some extra grit, force another important decision point, and ensure that button economy that you use for things like rerolls and to move campaigners around had enough value and had enough scarcity in the market to make it not just a sort of giveaway. So it was those sort of phases of like, all right, we've got this, and like rewriting cards throughout as the congressional track, and the different card decks come into play.
And so people I've seen online have reactions to playing the opposition. Most of the reactions, all the reactions I've seen, people are not comfortable with it. They say it's a difficult thing. And I suppose part of the game is making it difficult for the suffragettes to win. How does putting complexity against something that is so obviously a good into the game challenge you personally?
Well, personally, I never thought much about it. It's a game, and I don't know, you have the good guys and you have the bad guys, and that playing the bad guys is just that play. I learned the most from building out that deck. Like, I learned a lot in the suffrage deck. There's a lot that just is not what you would find on the Wikipedia page. But I learned the most from the opposition deck. And people tell me that they think about how they never realized that women opposed suffrage or were opposition leaders, that they never thought about the way that industry was manufactured. And in the deck itself, in the opposition deck, there's a lot of elements of the suffrage movement itself that creates opposition and creates sort of reduced power, whether that's xenophobia, schisms and backlash and that kind of a thing. I was a debater in high school, debated in high school and college, and you argue everything from an affirmative and a negative side. You go back and forth all day, and that arguing things from both sides gives you a lot of understanding about these issues, and they let you figure out where you fall on any given issue. And so I really hope and wish, and if you're listening now, that you will try giving opposition a chance and playing as that side. And what you learn about backlash and about the people that are opposed to suffrage and to movements, you can learn and understand about why people might be opposed to civil rights and to social rights today, because we still have opposition to social rights today. And it does us no good to just say those people are gross and I don't want to learn anything about them. That if we need to obtain and move forward, we have to have some understanding so that the people in the middle feel understood and heard and will feel like they belong on our side and not just like these two sides are too much. So I know that I know now that people feel gross playing opposition, but that's sort of the point. And that, if you really hate losing when you play board games, try playing opposition because it's a much nicer way to lose. I think it's a win-win when you lose as opposition.
So we've spoken a lot about the historical context of the game and all of that sort of stuff, but why is Votes for Women a good game? Take away all of the sort of the politics and the didactic elements to it. Why should people sit down and play Votes for Women if they're gamers?
Votes for Women is an incredibly balanced, incredibly tense game that lets you, as you go over the course of the game, feel like you're never quite sure who's going to win. There's very few blowouts in Votes for Women. That balance, that tension, that asymmetry creates just a really engaging time. And I think that the play itself, stripped of any theme and every context, is just a well-constructed card-driven game that builds upon what works in previous iterations, be it Twilight Struggle or Watergate, and creates a great, streamlined, approachable, easy-to-learn system. So you can get to it pretty quickly, plays much quicker than your average war game, and when you finally finish, there's a real feeling of like you've learned something and you've done something, which I don't think, it always happens in gameplay.
And so we sort of spoke about it earlier that it's surprising to people that aren't within this niche that board games deal with sort of important political issues. What is the point of Votes for Women? Is it educational? Is it about fun? Is it didactic? Do you want people to subscribe to a particular sort of political viewpoint when they play it? What is the point of the game?
I think first and foremost, the point of Votes for Women is that it's fun to play, and that without the engaging gameplay, nothing else matters. No one will ever bother. But once you get over that hump that you've enjoyed playing it, I want it to be a tool for people to realize how important it is for us to come together to challenge power. That individually we might feel like we can't amend the Constitution or enfranchise half the country, but that coming together has incredible value, incredible potential. And whether it's joining an organization in your town, whether that's staying involved in what happens in state politics or local at a semi-national level, or federal level in Congress, not that anything much happens in Congress, in American Congress these days, by getting together, by getting involved and paying attention and taking action, we can make the kind of world we want to live in. It's pretty agnostic about what that world looks like, besides there's democratic participation and enfranchisement, that there's more people involved, not fewer, there's more rights, not fewer. That tends to be in the United States the domain of one political party, but not entirely. And we still have a lot of work to do. But I think that Votes for Women is agnostic in what it is, the kind of world you want to see, but it encourages you to get together and to take action on that world, and that you have much more power when you're doing it together, in whatever that world might be.
And so for people watching this who are curious and they've played the game, and of course, a hour-long, hour-and-a-half board game can't encapsulate a whole movement. Do you have any sort of books that people could read that they would find interesting that aren't sort of in the Library of Congress, that are sort of popular history that we could use to learn about this?
Sure. Recasting the Vote was a great book about the various women of color who were involved in the suffrage movement, who were left out of the sort of official history books. I think Suffrage is also a great book, a decent synopsis. And I would recommend that folks read The Women's Hour, about the sort of final stage of the campaign. The final voting in the game itself, the phase once Congress has passed through, when you're putting the checks and X's on the board, has been a bit divisive. People don't always like the way that final voting works. It feels like a little bit of a roll off, but it adheres to the history of what it was like and what the suffrage movement was going through in the final roll. And so I think folks will have a better appreciation for why final voting feels like it does, learning about the Tennessee campaign and about how down to the wire the campaign went in 1920. It was never a given, and it's really important to remember that these basic rights were never a given in the first place, and that we take them for granted now, but required a lot of work, a lot of strategy, and a lot of really smart, dedicated people to get it done.
So 2 more questions then. So okay. First question, you're at a convention and you go out in the evening and you go to the loo and you're coming back and you hear a table talking about votes for women. So you sidle into the corner and you eavesdrop on them to hear what they're saying. What do you hope they're saying about you?
Well, about me or the game? Those are 2 different questions.
Well, the game, and by extension, you as a designer.
Yes. I hear people talking about votes for women, and I hope they are saying that they are surprised how much they liked it. I've been really heartwarmed by folks who say they just weren't sure about the theme, but ended up playing and really liking it and learning it, right? Like, I want people who are fans of history and women's history specifically, and feminist power, women, girl vote, rock, to love it. I really want people that aren't already bought in to give it a chance and to love it. And so people saying that they were surprised how good it was and how much they learned and how fun it was, that I think would be ultimately. And if they were talking about me, I want them to say that I'm funny and smart and very good looking.
So last question then. Why is gaming good?
Gaming is good because it allows us to play. And play is one of those fundamental human behaviors, like love and clapping, that can unite us and bring us together. It allows us to try on new ideas, new modes of being in a safe environment that failure and victory are sort of, up in the air, could, end up either way. I think gaming is good because it brings us together, and it's great because it helps us think about ways things could be.
Excellent. Well, Tory Brown, thank you very much.
Ben, thank you. This has been wonderful.